Hi, everyone. Welcome. I will give us all a few minutes until we all get in and get comfortable in our seats. Okay, we have 75 people in the room, so I think we can start. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Caroline O'Donnell, chair of the architecture department, and I'm incredibly excited to have the opportunity to welcome you all to the beginning of this symposium, and especially this event tonight. Before we get started, I'd like to say that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Goyokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Goyokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Goyokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Goyokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. In 1871, the Department of Architecture was amongst the first departments founded at Cornell University, where, I quote from founder Ezra Cornell, "Any person can find instruction in any study." 150 years later, we're celebrating our department's sesquicentennial via many events, but this symposium, Breaking Grounds, is structured as a 3-part symposium plus a keynote. That's what's happening right now, examining the fundamental interconnectedness of our discipline with global ecologies and cultures, alongside the consideration of future trajectories for the practice and pedagogy of architecture. The Preston H. Thomas Symposium is funded through a gift to Cornell's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning from Ruth and Leonard B. Thomas of Auburn, New York, in memory of their son, Preston. So while an anniversary calls for celebration, we're also provided with an opportunity to zoom out and to reflect, to ask and to probe the answers to important questions. The discipline of architecture, as we all know at this moment, is at a pivotal moment with regard to our critical engagement with our histories and foundations, the evolution of design practice and its concerns, and the approaches to pedagogy that guide emerging generations of architects. Our community is ready to disrupt and advance our thinking about possible worlds that are more sustainable, equitable, smart, and meaningful in the future. And of course, let's just stay here. When we begin with foundations, the literal ground on which our institution was built, we must also think of the ground that was dispossessed from the people native to this area in order for this institution to exist. And beyond that, when we think about questions of ground and of land in relation to those native to this area, we open up a whole world of theory and folklore on what the ground and the earth actually mean, that are very relevant to theories and practices that are resurfacing in our discipline today. So I will say a lot more about, especially about the meaning of the title, Breaking Grounds, on Thursday in person. But for tonight, I want to keep it brief and really limit myself to sharing the plan for the symposium over the next few weeks and give as much time as possible to our speaker tonight. If you do not remember, we will be reminding you, students, as you were reminded today, with a mini chocolate bar and a flyer on your desk each day of the presentation. So this is the first of 4. They're all on Tuesdays or Thursdays. They're all in person, except for this one. They all begin at 5:15, and they are all, except for this one today, followed by a reception in Milstein Dome. This Thursday, in 2 days from now. This is not advancing. Here we go. March 10th is the first session, groundwork at 5:15. The session will have a cold opening with The Words That Come Before All Else by Sam George. So do be there on time. It's not to be missed. And as the name suggests, it is something that has to come before all else. So it's happening right at the beginning at 5:15. The words that come before all else, for those of you who are new for whom this is new. It's an ancient supplication of the indigenous Six Nations people. It's an address, not a prayer, but expresses gratitude and empathetic connection to all of creation. So a really nice way to get started on Thursday. Beginning with the grounds on which our institution was built, the session establishes a foundation upon which architecture's interconnectedness with land, water, and air are built. And the session will have 3 speakers, half an hour each: Amber Adams, Meredith Palmer, and Sebastian Marot, with moderators and respondents Jolene Rickard and Sean Anderson moderating a discussion afterwards. On Thursday, March 17th, that's a week from Thursday, also at 5:15, also with a reception. The session number 2 is called Formwork and examines forms of practice that have emerged from Cornell's pedagogy and asks, how will our discipline transform and what can architects build in the future? This will be a series of presentations and conversation with Nina Cook-John, Arthur Huang, and Laurie Brown, with respondents and moderators Marta Wisniewska and Lily Chi. And then the final session, called Schoolwork, is on Tuesday, the 22nd. The session looks at the education of the architect and asks how we might reimagine architectural pedagogy for an evolving world. And that is with Dean Milton Curry from the University of Southern California School of Architecture, Dean Sarah Whiting from Harvard GSD, and our own Jamie Jin-Yoon from Cornell, the Dean of Architecture, Art, and Planning here. And that session will be moderated by Jenny Sabin and Maria Gonzalez-Pendas. I'm really excited to report that we will be able to have a reception in person with food that has been really very well considered, with menus inspired by early university banquet menus. And I'll elaborate on each of the menus before each of the sessions. Today, the keynote is by Timothy Ingold, and I will leave it to Tao Dufour to introduce Tim properly. I will just say that in this talk, Does Architecture Stack Up? Rethinking Ground, Generation, and Education, Tim will examine these 3 aspects he will kind of set the scene and prepare us to examine these 3 sessions tonight. And we're really grateful for Tim writing this original piece of work to help us think through all of these questions. I'd just like to take one more minute. On Thursday, I would like to give the full round of thanks to all the people who have helped. But just really quickly tonight, I'd like to thank the faculty who have had input on this symposium, especially Lily Chi, Sean Anderson, and John Sisovich. Also Alix and all of the communications team, and Edith. But most especially Wendelin Gonzalez, teaching associate here at Cornell. Wendelin deserves huge credit for putting together such a thoughtful and synergistic lineup. She's done an incredible job, so applause for Wendy. Thanks so much, Wendy. I'll now turn it over to Tao Dufour, my colleague, and I will just say, Tao and I have actually been talking for many years about Tim Engel and how excited we would be to do anything, have a lecture, have a symposium, or even a shared class where we'd be able to talk about some of the ideas that Tim has been putting forth over the last about 10 years since Tao and I started our conversations about him. So I think we're both really excited to have the opportunity to do this together as well. So thanks, Tim, and thanks, Tao.
Yes, thanks. Thank you so much, Caroline. Can I be heard well? Yes, clearly. Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Caroline. And it's really a distinct honor and indeed a pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest and keynote speaker for this year's Preston Thomas Memorial Symposium, Breaking Grounds, Professor Timothy Ingold. Professor Ingold is Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen, Fellow of the British Academy, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He has had a long, illustrious career being one of the most significant and influential anthropologists of the late 20th century and of recent decades, whose work has been seminal for his and subsequent generations of scholars, instituting paradigm shifting, or I should say, in light of our theme, groundbreaking empirical and theoretical research on questions of environmental perception and its relation to skilled practice and to technology, the role of animals in human society, and the intersections and interface between anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture, what he calls the 4 A's. So I will be drawing, of course, on Professor Ingold's own descriptions of his work in introducing him, but at moments infusing my understandings. So that the introduction flows, I've blended my thoughts into the text, which I hope remains faithful to the sense of what is truly an extraordinary life's work. Tim's Ingold work and thought threads knowledges across disciplines in a way that delicately and profoundly illuminates the human condition, our relations to animals, and levels of involvement with our environment and interlaced worlds. His work has foregrounded questions of embodied skills of perception and action within social and environmental contexts of development, which established a new paradigm replacing traditional models of genetic and cultural transmission that imply certain unresolved dualisms. He is a prolific author, starting with his doctoral research undertaken in the 1970s at the University of Cambridge, where I actually first discovered his work in terms of my own research, but I'll speak about this more personal encounter towards the end, which is his doctoral research, which resulted in his monograph, The Scout Lapse Today. This was a study of the ecological adaptation, social organization, and ethnic politics of the small minority community, the Scout Sami, in Northeast Finland under conditions of post-war resettlement. This early study was expanded as Professor Ingold continued his research on northern circumpolar peoples, leading to his second book, Hunters, Pastoralists, and Ranchers, Reindeer Economies and Their Transformations, and later research among the Finnish people to examine how farming, forestry, and reindeer herding were combined on the level of local livelihood to investigate the reasons for the intense rural depopulation in the region. These early researches led Professor Ingold towards a more general concern with human-animal relations and the conceptualization of humanity-animality interface, as well as with the comparative anthropology of hunter-gatherer and pastoral societies. It is perhaps in terms of his work on the broader theme of human-animal relations through which he articulates his uniquely phenomenological approach that intersects in wonderful and revealing ways with the biological, evolutionary, and ecological sciences that Professor Ingold's work captured the attention and imagination of researchers in disciplines beyond anthropology, including architecture. This extremely careful and ethnographically grounded investigation of humanity-animality interface, I would suggest, is perhaps more urgently needed in the present situation of environmental and political crises to resituate the fundamental problem of ethical human relations without either losing sight of animality or ontologically flattening the human. As a then lecturer in social anthropology at the University of Manchester, Professor Ingold published 2 important books, The Appropriation of Nature, which was a collection of essays on the aforementioned themes, and a major volume, Evolution and Social Life, which was a study of the ways in which the notion of evolution has been handled in the disciplines of anthropology, biology, and history from the late 19th century to the present. A deep engagement with the question of animality and cultural attitudes to animals has been one of the hallmarks of Professor Ingold's work, expressed in his edited volumes, What is an Animal? And co-edited 2-volume work, Hunters and Gatherers. one of the fundamental themes running through both anthropology and philosophy is the question of the status of language as ontologically definitive of the human. And added to this, the status of technology, understood basically as the facility for tool making in its relation to knowledge. Professor Ingold's work has taken on this classic problem, reconsidering tool making and speech as criteria for human distinctiveness. Publications addressing this theme include his co-edited volume, Tools, Language, and Cognition in Human Evolution. Through this research, Professor Ingold has sought ways of bringing together the anthropologies of technology and art, linking themes of environmental perception and skilled practice, and developing a relational approach focusing on the growth of embodied skills of perception and action within social and environmental contexts of development, as presented in his highly influential book, The Perception of the Environment, Essays on Livelihood, Dwelling, and Skill. Professor Ingold was chair in 1990 and Max Gluckman Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Manchester in 1995. He's been recognized by distinguished titles and awards, including, as I mentioned, being elected Fellow of the British Academy in 1997 and Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2000. He was president of the Anthropology and Archaeology section of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1999 and was the recipient of the Huxley Memorial Medal, awarded to him by the Council of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland in 2014, the highest honor of the Institute. Professor Ingold was the inaugural chair of social anthropology at the University of Aberdeen, where he was instrumental in establishing the UK's youngest department of anthropology there in 2002. A particularly delightful title that points to recent projects is his Explorations in the Comparative Anthropology of the Line, which seeks to forge a new approach to understanding the relation in human social life and experience between movement, knowledge, and description. Professor Ingold continues to explore the 4 A's in his volume, Making, Anthropology, Archaeology, Art, and Architecture, and his forthcoming book, Knowing from the Inside, Cross-Disciplinary Experiments with Matters of Pedagogy. His most recently published volume, Imagining for Real, Essays on Creation, Attention, and Correspondence, as its wonderfully playful title suggests, foregrounds the question of imagination in relation to his extraordinary and seminal work on embodiment and environmental perception. So I would like to now say a bit about my own initial engagement with Professor Ingold's work. I recall quite distinctly the first time I encountered the writing of Tim Engel. It was during my early years of doctoral studies at Cambridge University. I had just made my way through Martin Heidegger's Being and Time very slowly over the course of a month. At the time, it was not quite the question of the ontological status of the human being that concerned me, as much as that of a class of Yoruba divinities called Orishas. I was dissatisfied with Heidegger's discussion of so-called primitive societies in terms of the concept of thrownness, Geworfenheit in German, and equally so with Ernst Cassier's thesis of symbolic form, here in reference to the famous and so-called Davos disputation between the two philosophers. But I was fascinated by Heidegger's discussion of tools and of things. This was a major theme for close friends whom I met in the anthropology department there, Rebecca Empson and Martin Hallbrad, who would go on to become established scholars themselves. The question of how, in certain societies, things seem to be experienced as imbued with subjectivity. It was at this point where I came across a text by Professor Ingold, Tim, if I may, that he himself described as a preliminary sketch titled Building, Dwelling, Living, How Animals and People Make Themselves at Home in the World. I was in the reading room of Cambridge University Library. designed by the British architect, Sir Giles Gilbert Scott. The room was softly lit with long parallel tables of a peculiar turquoise hue that seemed to glow. I'm not sure if this memory in its hazy character indicates an actual coloration of the table or a more general mood of turquoise that has to do with the lighting. From the outside, the building looked like what the Etruscans would have built had the Industrial Revolution occurred 2.5 millennia ago. On the inside, the reading room had the aura of something perhaps the 18th century French architect Etienne Louis Boulet would have designed had he been Etruscan. It was a special room for me at that time. The book containing Tim's chapter was not on the stacks, but had to be fetched. It was titled Shifting Contexts, Transformations in Anthropological Knowledge, edited by Marilyn Strathern. I revisited the text in thinking through this introduction, and it was in reading it that the perceptual environment of first encounter was conjured in memory and through imagination. The ideas that Tim's prose guided me through, as if walking within a field animated by a chorus of cicadas, have the fleshy texture, illuminating coloration, and spectral Etruscan forms of the environment of the reading room. Although Tim's text was, as the title suggests, working with Heidegger's now well-known essay on dwelling, which has echoes of his earlier work on the equipmental quality that characterizes one's practical engagement with things encountered environmentally. Tim's text carefully and with a power that is only possible through care shifted the ground of human historicity, Heidegger's design, in such a way so as to incorporate the non-human animal in the ongoing process of forming our environments and our worlds. This work of Tim's is now an old text published in 1995. And I don't mean to suggest that his thought has not moved past this instant, but it was revelatory for me, as illuminating as the gentle glow of the turquoise surface upon which I first encountered it. I use myself here merely as an example that is more intimate, to indicate what is actually an extraordinarily profound and lasting influence Tim's work has had, not only on his discipline of anthropology, but on our home discipline here at Cornell of architecture. Please join me in warmly welcoming our distinguished guest, Professor Tim Engel.
Well, thank you very much. I'm greatly honored by all that. And it's a pleasure to be with you all, albeit virtually. So let me begin by reading short excerpts from the works of two very different authors. The first is the Scottish author, Nan Shepard, a native of the city of Aberdeen, where I also live. Shepard was a teacher by profession, but also a keen walker who spent many long days roaming the Cairngorm Mountains. And during the 1940s, she wrote a little book in praise of the Cairngorms entitled The Living Mountain. It was left in a desk drawer and not published until 1977. And even then, few knew of the book. And only in the last few years has it emerged as a classic of Scottish literature, so celebrated indeed, that it appears, that Shepard's portrait now appears on the £5 banknotes issued by the Bank of Scotland. So here it is, just coming up.
Tim, you're not sharing your screen with us yet. Oh, there you go. Okay, great.
I'm just about to, just give me a moment. Slideshow from beginning. There we are. So there's a picture of Nan Shepard on the Scottish £5 banknote. And here's Shepard describing what it feels like to stretch out on the mountaintop. So there I lie on the plateau, under me the central core of fire from which was thrust this grumbling, grinding mass of plutonic rock. Over me the blue air, and between the fire of the rock and the fire of the sun, scree, soil and water, moss, grass, flower and tree, insect, bird and beast, wind, rain and snow, the total mountain. Slowly, I have found my way in. Now, my second author is the ecological psychologist James Gibson, whose classic monograph, The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, was first published in 1979. And Gibson begins by setting out the key constituents of the terrestrial environment as they would manifest themselves to a perceiver placed within it. The environment consists, he says, of three components, namely a medium, substances, and the surfaces that separate substances from the medium. And just to continue in his words, our planet consists mainly of earth, water, and air, a solid, a liquid, and a gas. The earth forms a substratum. The water is formed by the substratum into oceans, lakes, and streams, and the formless gases of the air make a layer of atmosphere above the earth and water. The interface between any two of these three states of matter, solid, liquid, and gas, constitutes a surface. The earth-water interface at the bottom of the lake is one such. The water-air interface at the top is another. And the earth-air interface is a third, the most important of all surfaces for terrestrial animals. This is the ground. It is the ground of their perception and behavior, both literally and figuratively. It is their surface of support. So let me just compare these two passages. For both Shepard and Gibson, atmospheric air is up above and the earth is deep down below. But what lies between sky and earth? Well, for Gibson, it is the ground, conceived as a solid platform of support that separates the air above from the earth below. But for Shepard, what lies between is, well, everything, the total mountain. So what's going on here? How can there be such different views, and which is right? Well, in Gibson's characterization, as we've seen, the ground is an earth-air interface. Now, by definition, an interface has two sides, whether topside and underside or outside and inside. And while the interface serves to keep the two sides separate, confined to their respective domains, it is also perforated by holes or keys that allow information and sometimes materials to pass from one side to the other. A metalled road or pavement, for example, may be perforated by drains that allow rainwater through to underground channels, or manholes that allow human access to subsurface infrastructure. The paved surfaces of the city, of course, also provide support for its inhabitants. Indeed, the campaign to pave the urban environment in the modern era was driven above all by its twin functions of support and separation. On the one hand, the paved surface provided a secure foundation for fast and efficient transport, above all by means of wheeled vehicles, which might otherwise become stuck in mud or be overturned by surface irregularities. On the other hand, paving was considered to benefit public health, since it sealed the ground, preventing the stench of the earth from rising into the air, where it was believed to cause illness among those who breathed it. Yet on a paved surface, nothing can grow. For growth to occur, earth and air must meet and mingle. Where the ground has been paved, growth is only possible through cracks in the pavement. That is, until the surface itself, overwhelmed by the elemental forces of earth and air, eventually crumbles. Well, let's now leave the city for the countryside and join with Shepard in the mountains. Here, the ground is not paved, and its surface has only one side, not two. It is not an interface. It is not hard. And for plants, at least, it is not a surface of support, but a medium. Plants grow in the ground. They don't rest upon it. And from the plant's point of view, indeed, the ground is not really a coherent foundation at all, but an indistinct and permeable limit of illumination, above which it shoots out green leaves, but below which it adopts the different habit of root growth. So how can we describe this kind of surface? Well, to answer this question, I'd like to compare the ground of habitation to the page of writing. It's an ancient analogy that can even be traced etymologically to the origin of the English word page, which comes from the Latin pagus, meaning an area of inhabited countryside with its farms and fields, from which are also derived the English word peasant for the farmer and the French word paysage for the landscape he tends. The act of writing with pen on parchment would then be likened to that of tilling the fields with a plough. In the days when almost everyone knew how to handle a plough, but few could write, it was a natural comparison to make. Now, of course, the situation is reversed. Almost everyone can write, but how many still know how to handle a plough? Now, the parchment that medieval scribes used for their principal writing material was highly absorbent, and it was also very expensive. For that reason, the same material was commonly used over and over again. To reuse a parchment that has already been written upon, you have first to scrape the surface with a knife so as to remove as much of the original traces as possible. You can then write again, and in principle, you can repeat the operation until eventually the parchment is scraped so thin that it's no longer usable. However, since the material is so absorbent, the traces of previous writing can never be completely removed. So on a parchment that has been used several times, recent inscriptions appear to cut through the ever fainter traces of earlier ones, giving rise to what students of writing call a palimpsest. Now, modern readers who are conditioned by their familiarity with the printed word can all too easily jump to the conclusion that the formation of the palimpsest is equivalent to overprinting, in which one layer of inscription is simply added over another. But a closer look at how the palimpsest is formed reveals it to be precisely the opposite. And let me explain by means of this diagram. It shows a parchment in exaggerated cross-section, such that a line of ink appears as a vertical mark, as wide as the line is thick, and as deep as the ink sinks into the fabric of the parchment. Now, in the diagram, I've indicated two lines inscribed at time t0. So here's one, and here's the other one. Then later, at time t1, the surface is scraped, and two new lines are inscribed close to the old ones. This one here, and this one here. The same is done again at time t2. This one here, and this one here. Now, looking at the surface at time t2, observe what has happened to the traces. The original traces from t0 are just visible right at the surface. The traces from t1 are shallower than they were, but are still clear. The traces, but the deepest of all are the most recent traces from t2. So far from past inscriptions sinking ever further down as new ones are added on top, quite the reverse occurs. It is the past that rises even as it is undercut by the present. Now, it's just the same with the ground. Archaeologists in particular have seized upon the metaphor of the palimpsest to refer to a ground that over the ages has been repeatedly used, eroded, and used again. One of the originators of the analogy, the archaeologist Osbert Crawford, writing in the early 1950s, expressed it thus, and I'll just quote: "The surface of England is like a palimpsest, a document that has been written on and erased over and over again, and it is the business of the field of archaeology to decipher it. The features concerned are, of course, the roads and field boundaries, the woods, the farms and other habitations, and the other products of human labor. These are the letters and words inscribed on the land." Well, just setting aside the nationalist tenor of his remarks, I'd like to draw attention to the paradox they embody namely that it sets archaeologists to work in deciphering traces of the past that by rights should already have been erased by the present. That there's something left for them to work on is an index of the fact that erasure is never complete, that something always remains. Suppose, for example, that you're surveying a landscape for evidence of ancient trackways. The most ancient tracks, worn by feet from centuries past, are now barely visible traces on the surface, on the point of vanishing. It may take a specialist eye to see them. Unless artificially preserved, the weather will soon wipe them out altogether. By contrast, the newest incisions, recently cut in the landscape and not yet subject to significant erosion, are strongly marked. And in between are historic traces that, while manifestly weather-beaten and sometimes obscured, are still easy to recognize. Thus, in the land, just as on parchment, the past is not buried under the present, but actually closest to the surface, while the present, undercutting the past, digs deepest. The past comes up as the present goes down. This is not a layering so much as a turning over. And keep this idea in mind because I'll return to it. Now, were the ground an interface between the substances of the earth and the atmospheric medium, as Gibson imagined it, then it would look in cross-section something like this, in this image here. Outside the paved environment of the city, however, the ground has no topside or underside. It doesn't, as in this diagram, hold the earth and the atmosphere apart. On the contrary, as Shepard understood, the ground is the zone of their interpenetration. It is a palimpsest. The ground as palimpsest doesn't separate the earth from the sky or serve as an interface mediating exchanges between the two. It is rather where earth and sky are rolled into one, where rain meets soil and turns it to mud, where wind meets sand and blows it into dunes, where snow meets ice and coats the surface in a blanket of white. Here, to recall Shepard's words, between blue sky and bedrock are scree, soil and water, moss, grass, flower and tree, insect, bird and beast, wind, rain and snow. So the ground thus understood exemplifies what I want to call a deep surface. Formed as the Earth's rising up or eruption meets the atmosphere's beating down or erosion, this ground has depth, but it is of no measurable thickness. Should we attempt to measure it, we'd find that starting from the lower atmospheric horizon, there is no limit to how far up we could go, or starting from the upper earthly horizon, there's no limit to how far we could go down without ever reaching rock bottom. So in this diagram, I show what I mean. So it's the opposite of this. Okay. The double meaning of the English verb to wear aptly illustrates this understanding of the ground as a deep surface. The word wear can mean to put on, as in wearing clothes, but it can also mean to strip off, as a surface that is worn by use or by exposure to the elements. Now, were the surface an interface, then these two meanings would directly contradict one another. But with the palimpsest, they are one and the same, for it is in the very process of erosion that depth comes to the surface. This is a surface that covers but doesn't cover up, and such indeed is the surface of the ground. Now, I want to loop back now to the idea of turning by bringing in another concept, namely volume. The word volume comes from the Latin volvere, meaning to roll, and so it's cognate with such words as evolution and revolution. The original volume was a scroll of papyrus or parchment, usually inscribed with writing. To read it, the scroll had to be unrolled or evolved, after which it would be rolled up again or revolved. But later, as the scroll gave way to the manuscript book or codex, the continuous roll would be folded into sheets like a concertina, so that the reader, rather than unrolling the volume, would turn its pages, opening up each fold only to close its predecessor behind. On turning the page, recto to verso, what was once over goes under and what was once under goes over. But there was no going through. For every sheet, for although every sheet had two sides, it was not an interface. Rather, like the mythical Janus, the page was two-faced. And the only way to get from one face or side to the other was by the simultaneous folding and unfolding of the turn, as I've shown in this diagram here. But the codex was always open, regardless of the particular page to which it was turned. Not until the manuscript was replaced by the printed word was the book finally closed. For in the printed book, the pages are laid one over another to form a stack, as in this right-hand diagram here. Although you still have to turn the pages to read it, the book itself is now perceived as a thing of layered sheets to be worked through top to bottom as beginning to end. And that's why we typically think of the volume these days as a three-dimensional box or container to be filled with contents. Now, I've already compared the page and the ground. So has the ground then undergone a parallel transformation from the turnover to the stack? Well, it's true that you can't exactly roll up the ground like a scroll, but you can turn it. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of the medieval ploughman who would turn the ground with every turn of the seasons in the agricultural calendar. The purpose of ploughing is to bring to the surface nutrient-rich soil from deep down, while burying soil already drained of nutrients by previous cropping, along with any remaining weeds and stubble. Thanks to this continual turnover, the ground will continue to yield year after year. It is repeatedly renewed, not by adding layer upon layer as in a stack, but by breaking it, cutting it through with the share so as to raise the deep and bury the shallow. That's what makes the ground surface, like the scroll and the codex, into a volume. It's a surface that turns with the seasonal passage of time, with the alternations of weather and the husbandry of crops, wherein the past rises up even as the present sinks below. And this is a ground not just of cultivation, but of memory. For with its turning, memories of persons that lived or events that happened long ago are brought to the surface so that inhabitants can engage with them directly, as if present in the here and now. But with the volume reconceived as a box or container with contents layered in a stack, time no longer rolls, folds, or turns the ground. It rather pierces through successive grounds like an arrow, pointing either upwards from past to present or downwards from present to past. Here, every ground, every layer establishes its own plane of synchrony, while layer succeeds layer in a diachronic sequence. To reach the past, as in archaeological excavation, you have to dig down. Memory here is like an archive, deposited in stacks with the oldest records furthest down, and there they stay, sinking ever deeper as time moves on. As a deposit, the past contains no potential for renewal. It's over. Renewal can only come from superimposition, by adding another layer to the stack, and then another, and then another. And each successive layer is then understood as a fundamental platform, level, void, and hard, upon which everything stands, each in its proper location. We could say that the ground of turning here is, on this side, is soft. We leave footprints in soft ground, whether in wet mud, sand, snow, or moss. And for the same reason, footprints are impermanent and readily eroded by the weather. Prints are temporal things held within the seasonal round. But the ground of layering, by contrast, is hard. Whereas we leave footprints in the soft earth, on the hard surface of the pavement, we can only stamp. Paving, as we've seen, has upper and lower sides. It is interfacial. It has a measured depth, and its support is conditional on the strength or load-bearing capacity of its materials. But the immeasurable depth of soft earth is felt in its embrace of the atmosphere. And this embrace is unconditional. You can fall onto or into the earth, but you cannot fall through it. There can be gaps or holes in a pavement, but in the earth, there are neither gaps nor holes. There are only pits. And of course, the final pit in which we end our lives is the grave. Yet it is normal after burial for the pit to be covered over with a slab. And the slab, like a paving stone, does have a top side and an underside, as I've shown in cross-section in this rather macabre sketch. Once put in place, it covers up and conceals the body laid below. So here's the body and there's the slab. And over time, earth and vegetation will grow over the burial site, leaving it virtually indistinguishable from its surroundings, pending possible rediscovery through archaeological investigation. So is the earth open or closed? Perhaps, as the practice of burial suggests, it is both. As generations come and go, the earth alternately opens to the sky and turns against it. Maybe in a way, both Shepard and Gibson were right, even though each told only half the story. But what does this tell us about past and future? Well, that every one of us will eventually die is, of course, the one and only thing about the future of which we can be certain. Should we not then welcome uncertainty as we welcome life? Well, you wouldn't think so from the tone of regret with which we are so often told these days that we face an uncertain future. If only we could be more certain, if only we knew what fate awaits us, well, then we could plan ahead, prepare ourselves, perhaps even change things to weed out aspects of the future we don't like and choose those we do. To confess that the future is uncertain is to admit that we are still far from being able to do so, that life is not yet fully destined, and that there is still work to be done to determine where it will finally lead. The word conveys a sense of incompletion, of unfinished business, of having not yet gained the full measure of the world that would yield to total predictive confidence. There are still gaps in our knowledge, missing pieces that remain to be inserted. Nowadays, we look to the conjunction of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics lumped together under the acronym STEM or STEM to complete the picture. The appeal to STEM, of course, has little to do with the ways practicing scientists, technologists, engineers, or mathematicians actually work. The acronym serves rather as a front for the subordination of research and development to the interests of governments and corporations, which claim, as they say, to follow the science. And if the science's predictions look grim, as they do today, it is expected to propose mitigations to avoid complete catastrophe. And yet the science admits to no future beyond the predictive horizons of the present. Perhaps that's why today's younger generations are less inclined to see the future as a landscape extending indefinitely into the distance than as a plateau bearing down upon them. No previous generation has been so starkly presented with the prospect of the end of history, even of life itself. The future to them seems all too certain, nor is any relief to be found in a stance of denial through regression from certainty to uncertainty. It is a defining characteristic of life, however, that it continually exceeds itself. Far from running from beginning to end, every ending in life issues into new beginning. It is the curse of uncertainty that it presents this excess as a deficit, rendering the promise of beyond as the deficiency of not yet. And to lift the curse, we need to recast uncertainty as possibility. Now, for the science, radical possibility is hard to pin down. As the philosopher Henri Bergson put it, the domain of life is characterized by incommensurability between what goes before and what follows. And science, Bergson argued, is simply unable to cope with this idea of the absolute originality and unforeseeability of forms. It can work only on what repeats. And in the language of repetition, science can only think possibility on a scale of risk or probability. On this scale, what cannot be determined is left to chance. And indeed, the opposition between chance and determination is deeply etched into modern thought. It's an opposition, however, that drains life of its creative impulse, reducing freedom to random variation within a phase space. What would it take then to face the future as a realm not of uncertainty, but of possibility? Now, young people with their lives ahead of them are often encouraged to think of the life course as a process of fulfilling their potential. That is, as a movement of progressive closure in which all possible paths are gradually narrowed down to the one actually taken, which itself, at life's end, reaches its ultimate conclusion. With one's potential fulfilled, there is nowhere further to go. But what if instead of heading towards destinations unknown, we were to push out from places already reached, along a path of renewal that knows no end? Could this be what the Pintupi, an Aboriginal people of Western Australia, meant when they told their ethnographer, Fred Myers, that life, they said, is a one possibility thing? Now, this calls for some reflection. For the Pintupi, the contours of life are those of the country in which they dwell, a country created by the ancestral beings as they moved around in the formative era known as the dreaming. Every existing creature, as the incarnation of the ancestral power from which its vitality is derived, effectively finds itself on the inside of an eternal moment of world creation. And where the ancestors led, life is bound to follow. But this is not a movement from A to B, from a starting point to a destination. It rather carries on. Life is a one possibility thing for the Pintupi, because possibility can only ever be one. The idea that people could initially be presented with multiple possibilities, like a menu of options from which to choose, only to be narrowed down as life proceeds, would make no sense to them. For Pintupi people, as they roam their desert landscape, are not fulfilling their potential, but ever replenishing. They may indeed have more power towards the end of life than at the beginning. So how then can we express this difference between possibilities and possibility, that is, between fulfillment and replenishment? Well, one way to do this might be to call on a distinction between doing and undergoing, which was central to the philosophy of John Dewey, especially in his essay of 1934 on art as experience. In life, Dewey acknowledged, we do all kinds of things. We do first this and then that. And as with this and that, there is a degree of certainty in the ends to be achieved. Yes, we know what we're doing. Every deed is an intentional act, like shooting an arrow at a target. And yet, in everything we do, there is an experience we undergo. We are modified in body and mind, perhaps even transformed by the doing of it. And the question for Dewey was to figure out the relation between the two, between the doing and the undergoing. Dewey put undergoing inside doing, sandwiched between the original intention and its final consummation? Is undergoing something that happens to us inside the act? Well, if undergoing were thus contained within doing, Dewey thought, there could be no continuity from one deed to the next. Life would fragment into a scatter of disconnected episodes. Blink and they're gone. What happens in reality, quite to the contrary, is that undergoing always overflows doing, to the extent that whatever you do takes into itself something of the experience of what you did before, and is in turn carried over into what you do next. With every doing, as Dewey put it in a later lecture on experience and education, with every doing, you are a somewhat different person. In short, undergoing lies precisely in the excess by which life overtakes the destinations thrown up in its wake. So we could describe every act of doing, as I've shown here, by a transverse connection between an intention, I, and an objective, O. So we have a series of doings, each one going from an intention to an objective. But the life of undergoing carries on in a direction orthogonal to these transverse links. And in the figure, this is represented by this wavy line, P. Here, stat P stands for possibility. So possibilities cut across, but life as a one possibility thing is longitudinal. It goes on through. And a life tracked along this line is continually, that's along this line here, is continually overtaking itself. It is a line of becoming rather than being, yielding up not to objective consequences, for these are but discards left along the way, but to further possibility, not just for itself, but for all the other lives with which it tangles, including, as we'll see, its generational offspring. Now, crucially, while every transverse connection denotes a line of intention, the longitudinal trail, this line P, of possibility, the longitudinal trail of possibility is a line of attention. Now, there are two sides to attention, exposure and attunement. I take the idea of attunement from the ecological approach to perception pioneered by James Gibson, to which I've already referred. For Gibson, perception is about noticing things in our surroundings that may help or hinder in the furtherance of our own activity. In a word, it's about picking up information that specifies what these things afford. And it can be learned. One can keep on learning to perceive, Gibson writes, for as long as life goes on. In the practice of a craft, for example, skill lies in becoming sensitized to subtle variations in the material that a novice might miss. The carpenter attends to the grain of the wood, the smith to the ductility of iron. The skilled practitioner's perceptual system, in Gibson's terms, becomes attuned to information of a certain sort. And this fine tuning of perception amounts, he says, to an education of attention. Yet in this, the momentum is entirely on the side of the perceiver. It is as if the things to be perceived were already there, laid out in the environment, merely awaiting the practitioner's attention. But what if everything is not already there? The world, after all, is not set in stone, but restless and fluid, bustling with life. Think of the fluxes of the weather, the ever-changing skies, the turn of the tides, the run of the river, the movements of animals and the growth of plants. Immersed in these fluxes, it is the perceiver who must wait upon the world, attending to it in the sense of abiding with it and doing its bidding. And this is attention on the side of exposure. As the philosopher of education Jan Maschlein explains, exposure, from the Latin ex plus positio, literally means to be pulled out of position. To be or to become attentive, writes Mascheline, is to expose oneself. And in this condition, one can no longer take anything for granted. The sense of understanding, of having solid ground beneath one's feet, is shaken, leaving one vulnerable and hyper-alert, wide-eyed in astonishment, rather than narrowly focused on a target. And for Mascheline, it is precisely in these moments of exposure that education occurs. It's not so much an understanding as an undergoing that at once strips away the veneer of certainty with which we find comfort and security and opens to pure possibility. Yet if there are two sides to attention, of exposure and attunement, of waiting on the world and tuning to a world in waiting, well then what is the relation between the two? Surely to embark on any activity means placing one's existence on the line. The safe course would be to stay put, but no one can live like that. To live, we have to get moving, to push the boat out into the current of a world in formation. And so all undergoing begins in exposure. But as it proceeds, skills of perception and action, born of practice and experience, begin to kick in. We see this in one of the most ubiquitous of all human activities, namely walking on 2 feet. Every step entails a moment of jeopardy. Falling forwards on 1 foot, you tumble into the void, only to regain your balance as the other foot comes to land on the ground ahead. Here, the bodily skill of footwork comes to the rescue just before it is too late. So what begins in the vulnerability of exposure ends in the mastery of attunement, providing in turn the ground from which the walker can once again submit to the hazard of exposure in an alternation that continues for as long as the walk goes on. Now, this alternation, I believe, is fundamental to all life. Crucially, just as life is a one possibility thing, it is also unidirectional. In real life, submission leads and mastery follows, never the reverse. Where submission casts off into a world in becoming, setting us loose to fall, mastery restores our grip so that we can keep on going. The first is a moment of aspiration, the second a moment of prehension. Out in front, an aspirant anticipation feels its way forward, improvising a passage through an as yet unformed world, while bringing up the rear is a prehensile perception already accustomed to the ways of the world and skilled in observing and responding to its affordances. And as submission gives way to mastery, aspiration to prehension, anticipation to perception, and exposure to attunement, there is what we could call a moment of inflection. And I draw this sense of inflection from the writings of the philosopher Erin Manning, for whom inflection is not a movement in itself, but a variation in the way movement moves, coming at the point where a tentative opening matures from within what Manning calls the cleave of the event into a firm sense of direction. It marks the turn from undergoing into doing, at which the line of possibility discloses distinct and realizable possibilities. Now, I've just slipped in 2 terms, namely aspiration and anticipation, both of which call for further explanation. Literally, to aspire is to draw breath. It is an active, animated taking in. And to take in, as Dewey observes, we must, and these are his words, we must summon energy and pitch it in a responsive key. With this summoning and pitching, aspiration calls upon the past in order to cast it forward into the future along a path of attention. Brimming with as yet undirected potential, with possibility, aspiration anticipates the future, but does not predict it. Prediction, as we've seen, belongs to the logic of certainty and uncertainty. Depending on the level of certainty, things may be predicted with greater or lesser confidence or judged to be more or less probable. But anticipation belongs to the register of possibility. It is the temporal overshoot of a life that always wants to run ahead of itself. And far from predetermining the final forms of things or fixing their ultimate destinations, anticipation opens a path and improvises a passage. It's a seeing into the future, not a projection of a future state in the present. It's to look where you're going, not to fix an endpoint. All life, then, is held in tension between submission and mastery, between aspiration and prehension, between anticipation and perception, and between exposure and attunement. In every case, the first leads and the second follows. What leads is an aspiration that wells up in attention. What follows is a precisely directed and skillfully executed maneuver. And as a one possibility thing, moreover, this life begins nowhere and ends nowhere, but carries on for all time, for an every when that in Australian Aboriginal cosmology is identified with the dreamer. And yet we know that every mortal being will certainly die. How then can the infinitude of life be reconciled with the finitude of individual life cycles? And to answer this question, we have to think again about generations. For there is a deeply held belief in many minds today, above all in those taught to follow the science, that life is lived within generations, but does not flow between them. What passes between generations, often described as a heritage or inheritance, is a legacy of information and resources which provides the capital from which successor generations can build lives in their turn. The information may be genetic or cultural, the resources material or immaterial, such as knowledge. Their sole common denominator is that they are available for transmission independently of their lifetime expression or achievement. And it's easy to see in this view a reflection of the idea that life is lived in the fulfillment of potential. And this leads us, we've observed, to a dead end. With all potential exhausted, there is no life to be continued in coming generations. Only the discards left along the way remain to be passed on. So each generation, occupying its own slice of time, seems fated to replace its predecessor and to be replaced in its turn, rather like layers in a stack. So here are 5 generations, one each layered on top of the one before. And this, of course, is the very same stack that we have already encountered in our reflections on the page and the ground. It betrays a kind of stratigraphic thinking that is deeply seared in modern sensibilities, leading to an easy equation of generational layers with layers of sedimentation in the history of the earth, of deposits in the occupation of a site, of documents in an archive, and even of consciousness in the human mind. It's a way of thinking that feeds directly into a rhetoric of extinction that wonders whether the coming generation or any after that might be the last, be it for our own or any other species. And it's the reason why we feel ourselves facing a future blighted by uncertainty. To restore a sense of possibility, we need to imagine generations differently. And this is what I've shown by turning each of those 5 generations lengthwise and depicting them like this, like a braid. We've seen that as a one possibility thing, life is lived not transversally, but longitudinally. So let's compare every particular life to one strand of an intergenerational braid. So here, One strand, another strand, and so on. The strand, each strand is only so long, but the braid can continue indefinitely, for even as old strands give out, new ones are paid in. Nothing here is inherited, nor does a break in the chain of transmission herald extinction. Rather, it is in the overlap of generations that the life process is carried on. As Bergson put it so vividly, just as the individual feels the swell of the past leaning over the present that is about to join it, so with life in general, we see each generation leaning over the generation that shall follow. And this leaning over is a gesture of kinship, of care, even of love. So this generation here is leading over the next one, which is leaning over the next, and so on. And herein, for Bergson, lies the true mystery of life, to which we should add its true possibility. How much are our fears of the end of history, of biodiversity loss, and of final extinction a function of the way we have sliced up generations, setting them over and against one another, denying both the productivity of their collaboration and the affectivity of their care? We need to bring them together again. And with this, we turn in the final part of my talk to the question of education. For more than 3 centuries in the Western world, education has been regarded as the engine of social progress. It has been the means by which advances in human knowledge, forged by bringing powers of reason to bear upon the material of empirical observation, have been passed on from one generation to the next, allowing each to build upon the achievements of its predecessors, thus contributing to the cumulative advance of civilization as a whole. An education that conforms to this progressive principle naturally gives pride of place to subjects of study that are deemed, in a modern idiom, to be scientific. For science, along with technology, engineering, and mathematics, nowadays packaged as STEM, is founded upon a claim to superior knowledge of how the world works, at least compared to the knowledge of so-called lay practitioners, which is so tightly bound to experience as to remain out of reach of explication and analysis. Almost by definition, the science is situated on a higher plane, at one remove from the theatres of practice in which it might be put to use. That's why scientific study typically separates learning from doing, the transmission of knowledge from its subsequent application. Science's elevation, however, has had the effect of pushing to the margins a range of subjects that appeal, as we might say in the idiom of modernity, more to sense than to reason, or to standards of judgment that are more aesthetic than logical. It's not that these subjects have no place in the curriculum. On the contrary, even in a society wedded to the ideal of progress, there is widespread recognition of the need to complement the detached objectivity, cold logic, and analytic rigor of science with something more subjective, attuned to feeling, empathy, and holistic understanding. This bifurcation is, of course, deeply sedimented in the modern constitution. We even have neuroscientists nowadays telling us that it is wired into the human brain in the division between its left and right sides. An education in non-STEM subjects, such as in the arts, is supposed to help with the development of the right side, tempering the dominance of the left, and offering students a more rounded formation that enhances their abilities to relate to their surroundings. I want to argue against this left-right complementarity with its implied divisions between objective knowledge and subjective experience, and between reason and expression. I contend that what we may broadly call the arts, here taken to include architecture and design, have a far more radical role to play than merely to provide the STEM curriculum with its non-scientific complement. And this role is to change the very meaning and purpose of education across every field of study, from the efficient transfer of knowledge from teachers of one generation to students of the next, to an endless journey of discovery on which teachers and students are embarked together, driven not by a humanistic ideal of progressive improvement, but by a passion to seek the truth of what is real and present in the world. So far from opening up a space for the cultivation of subjective self-expression, alongside and as a complement to the space of knowledge transfer, this is to bring students into an ongoing dialogue with the world itself, affording the possibility to attend to the things or beings to be found there, to answer to their presence, and to explore the conditions of coexistence with them. So instead of educating students in the subjects of art, here it is the practices of art that educate. And they do so by opening a path or showing the way, guiding attention towards aspects of the world that might be worthy of further examination. Now, this is to foster an attitude of what I call responsibility, by which I mean a capacity and a readiness to go along with things and to answer them. It's not a new idea. In fact, it was first introduced in 1957 in a lecture delivered by the composer John Cage. Only in the presence of things, Cage said, can we feel them, and only through feeling them can we respond. Apparently unaware of the precedent, the cultural theorist Donna Haraway has recently reinvented the term in much the same sense. Responsibility, she says, is a praxis of care and response. Yet Cage's was not the only precedent. For just a decade before Haraway was writing, the term was used by the educational philosopher Gert Biester. For Biester, responsibility refers to a certain voice. It's a voice of one's own that nevertheless comes forth only in its offering others the opportunity to respond in theirs. Like a line in a conversation or in polyphonic singing, every voice continually emerges in and through its joining with and differentiating from the voices of others. I call this correspondence, going along together and answering to one another as you go. And the question is, what if we were to imagine education in these terms, as a practice of correspondence rather than an engine of progress? What if we were to put the development of responsibility ahead of the cultivation of reason? The voice of reason, of course, belongs to no one. It transcends variations of experience. And it's this voice, both authoritative and impersonal, that scientific education aims to inculcate in students, specifically by dissociating knowledge from personal experience and making it accessible to all. In the community of reason, as the philosopher Alfonso Linguis puts it, everyone is interchangeable. Problems have their right answers, which is the same whoever happens to come up with them. A pedagogy of responsibility, however, would reverse the priorities of the scientific model, placing attention to ever-emergent difference ahead of standardized measures of attainment. If in the community of reason, everyone is interchangeable, in the community of responsibility, precisely the opposite obtains. People are bound together not because of their deference to a single voice, the voice of reason, but because every voice is different. It is a community, as Linguis says, of those who have nothing in common. Because they have nothing in common, each has something to give, something to contribute to the ongoing conversation. And this is a matter not of understanding, but of undercommoning. Understanding means finding support in a shared foundation, a hard ground upon which all can build. Undercommoning is just the opposite. Not a reversion to what we all have in common to begin with, not a defense of shared interests, but rather a way of living together in difference, in a world where nothing is certain and everything is possible. The soft ground of undercommoning is a palimpsest in which earth and sky intermingle. In her essay entitled The Crisis of Education, first published in 1954, the philosopher Hannah Arendt saw the crisis precisely in terms of the loss of attention born of hubris. Do we love the world enough, she asked, to assume responsibility for it? Only if we do, Arendt foretold, is there hope for generations to come. To love the world in our terms is to be responsible. In Haraway's terms, it is a praxis of care and response. It is in that sense to give back to the world what we owe for our own existence within it. But couldn't the same be said of education? Literally, to educate means to lead out. It comes from ex, meaning out, from ducere, meaning to lead. Education means lead out. So education leads us out into the world so that we can respond to it. And as a way of leading out, it is fundamentally a practice of exposure in precisely the sense of pulling out of position that I introduced earlier. Its purpose is not to arm ourselves with knowledge or to shore up our defenses so that we can better cope with adversity. It is rather to disarm, to relinquish the security of established standpoints and positions, and by the same token, to attend more closely to the world around us, enabling us to respond with skill and sensitivity to what is going on there. In this, teachers and students go along in each other's company, fellow travelers in the undercommons. Now, to think of education thus, as a way of leading life in the company of others, of corresponding with them in the undercommons, of coming together in difference, is to align it not with progress, but with sustainability. And by sustainability, I don't mean the achievement of a precarious state of balance, such that what we take from the world for our present consumption should not exceed its capacity for future renewal. Well, that would be to treat the earth as a standing reserve for the benefit of a globally distributed humanity. I refer rather to the continuity of life in a world that has room for everyone and everything else, both now and forever. But this means thinking quite differently about generations and their passage. We've already seen how modern thought tends to imagine every generation as a layer, each adding to the one before and building up a history in their succession. For progress theorists, history stacks up. And education, they say, is the means by which the legacy of each generation is passed on to the next. But where progress builds up and up, sustainability winds on and on. It is not stacked vertically, but braided longitudinally in the turnover of generations. Through most of human history, indeed, that is how lives have been carried on. Youngsters have grown up hearing the stories and observing the practices of their elders, both discovering the meanings of the stories and developing skills of practice in the passage of their own experience, and becoming storytellers and practitioners in their turn. In this lies the proper meaning of tradition, not a fixed body of heritable custom, but a way of life along which it is possible to move on in continuity with the values of the past, while laying down a path for others to follow. Now, the reasons for the shift in the way we think about life and generations, from the longitudinal to the sequential, or from braided lifelines to layers stacked up, are complex. They have much to do with capitalism's erosion of domestic modes of production and with the redeployment of educational functions from the family to the state. But for the past 3 centuries, we have managed to persuade ourselves that progress is unstoppable and that education, as it stacks every generation over the next, can lift human civilization to ever greater heights. Yet progress also carries its price in terms of environments permanently ravaged by the extraction of the resources needed to feed it, and of the ever-growing inequalities and injustices between the beneficiaries of progress and those who have lost out. This price, as we know only too well, has risen to the point at which the consequences of further escalation could be catastrophic. In short, progress and sustainability, like reason and responsibility, pull in different directions, one up, the other along. And we can't have both. And if we are to have a future that ever opens to new beginning, then the only option is along. And this means that education too must shift its priorities from reason to responsibility. It must be the way that generations, even as they overlap, can contribute to each other's ongoing formation. And with this, we can return finally to art, architecture, and design. In the year 2010, the Rhode Island School of Design began to champion the idea of incorporating these subjects into the STEM curriculum by adding in an A for arts. Thus, STEM was converted to STEAM, S-T-A-M. And this idea has since caught on and is widely touted as the future for arts education. It's a future that, in the eyes of its advocates, has already arrived, which is why their metaphors of choice are the cutting edge and state of the art. Nothing is more important in their view than preparing the coming generation for a world of cutthroat competition in which only the smart will survive, leaving the rest on the scrap heap of humanity rendered redundant by developments in digital technology and artificial intelligence. It would, in my view, be a gross betrayal were we to sacrifice the arts on the altar of such a dystopian and short-sighted vision. Quite to the contrary, I believe that the mission of the arts is to lead a revolution in the whole way we think about education and its role in society. I want to think of them not as subjects to be taught, as supplements to a curriculum centered on the scientific model of progressive education, but as ways of teaching in themselves, the purpose of which is to develop precisely the opposite of the instrumental, disengaged, and manipulative attitude epitomized in the word smart. This is an attitude of enduring attention, responsiveness, and care. Arguably, this attitude has always been the hallmark of true scholarship, even in fields that would nowadays come under the umbrella of science. It's there in the biologist's attention to living things, in the chemist's attention to the properties of materials, in the physicist's attention to matter itself. Technology and engineering likewise resemble craft in the perceptual acuity and respect for materials required of their practitioners. As for mathematics, the rootedness of mathematical understanding in gesture, rhythm, and trace, and its proximity to the arts of music and dance, have been evident since ancient times, notwithstanding the myths of intellectual genius that have grown up around it. For such giants of the past as Vitruvius, Alberti, Leonardo, and Constable, founding figures respectively in architecture, perspective, anatomy, and meteorology, science and art were never separate or even separable endeavors, but rather long-standing traditions of inquiry, unified in their commitment to careful observation, patient experimentation, precise description, and informed speculation. This is indeed how the real sciences and real scientists have always worked and still work today, feeling their way from within, guided by genuine wonder, curiosity, and care. But this calls for an imagination wholly distinct from that of the kind coveted by STEM, or even by STEAM. It is an imagination that, far from closing in on smart solutions, opens up to the possibility of the world's ceaseless formation, drawing its creative powers from the self-same source. Could the role of the arts, then, be to resituate this kind of imagination at the very heart of education, of leading life. Perhaps then, instead of immediately reaching for the science in our deliberations about the future, we can concentrate on relearning how to live with the elements which sustain all of existence, as our predecessors once did, and as plants and animals still do. Prioritizing the regeneration of human life and its coexistence with other living beings will mean turning our backs on the shiny corporate headquarters of STEM and reaching once more for the time-honored themes of kinship and descent that bind us to our fellow inhabitants of the ever-turning ground betwixt earth and atmosphere. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tim. My desk is a field of notes, you've taken us on quite an extraordinary journey, starting with Nan Shepard and James Gibson, and moving us through extremely complex and nuanced set of questions. So I believe that my role here, in a certain sense, is to help facilitate questions and also to kind of provoke conversation to a certain extent. Perhaps I might. Yes, so Andre has just indicated, please use the raise hand button to ask a question. Yeah, just to get some of those protocols in place. Maybe I'll just check with Andre. I can't see everyone, Andre, so will you call on persons who raise their hands? Is that a yes? Okay, great, that's yes. Yeah. So maybe I'll just start a little bit. I was particularly moved by the theme of love as it appeared every so often in your extremely kind of wonderful movement, kind of movement through your description and your thinking, and this relationship of love to the question of generation and of kind of intergenerational or transgenerational relationships. I thought quite moving, and the development, the critical dimension to your description itself developed in a kind of very, very, very careful and thoughtful way to certain contemporary understandings and conditions. I thought was also quite moving and guiding us through in a certain way. So I wanted to start maybe a little bit with that question of love, its relationship to generation, and then to a certain extent its relationship to the question of truth. I was curious about those three themes that seem to move through your presentation, and then maybe a bit in relation to that, your use of diagrams, your use of drawing, I thought was quite extraordinary, particularly in light of the fact that you started with the question of writing, the relationship of parchment to ground, the theme of the palimpsest, and in foregrounding these questions, you kind of produced your own drawings, your own diagrams, and somewhere within that was a certain question of language that you didn't necessarily speak to so overtly. The question of the role of language toward the end there was a certain theme around storytelling, narrative, and so forth. So perhaps maybe a second question might be, I wonder if you could speak a little bit, if not about the status of something like drawing, but maybe the role of your own diagrams and your own drawings in thinking through the extremely nuanced and interlaced set of problems that you foregrounded for us this evening.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yes, love really is important. I mean and it you know, it has to be at the center of everything. If we're concerned with how with the continuity of life, then the very first thing is your parents have children. There's a love of parents for their children, the way parents look after their children, and therefore it's in that overlap of generations where this love is happening, and if it wasn't there, you wouldn't have that degree of continuity. So where we have the problem that every particular life only goes on for so long, but life itself carries on indefinitely, that problem, or the key to solving that problem is this factor of love. I mean, if it wasn't for that, the rope wouldn't carry on at all. So it refers specifically to this, or at least in my discussion, I'm really thinking mainly about parental love. So it's really about that overlap of generations, which allows life to carry on despite the turnover of individuals. And I don't think this is in any sense unique to humans. Bergson himself says it's just the same with plants, with any kind of living being. Each generation leans over the one to follow. And I really want to emphasize that because, for example, in mainstream evolutionary biology, they have no understanding of that at all. The only relation between generations is one of inheritance, which, as you know, need not involve any love at all, and often quite the contrary. So that's where that really sticks. On the case of truth, there's another argument which I didn't bring in here about truth and about how truth goes beyond the facts. Certainly one of the things that worries me a lot in this era of post-truth, when people are worrying about the status of truth and think that we have to stick to the facts, only then do we know what is true. That gives us a very, very limiting idea of what truth is. And my feeling is that that truth goes beyond the facts at the point where what we're observing, what we're studying, begins to tell us how to observe. And for example, it took me ages to figure out what's going on with the palimpsest. And I drew hundreds of diagrams that I eventually came with that one, and I realized that's how it is. You know, the past goes up as the present goes down, and then everything was sort of sorted out. And the thing is, some of those diagrams were drawn when I could get into the university after it opened up again. They were drawn on a blackboard with chalk, and then I photographed them. And it makes a huge difference to be able to draw with chalk on a blackboard, because the chalk line actually, well, it's very material. You end up with your hands covered in chalk, but it really has a feel and a texture to it, a dynamism that you could never get with a sort of mechanically drawn diagram. And that for me is absolutely critical. It's the same reason why I always used to write by hand if I possibly could, though I'm cursed myself now for using the keyboard all the time. And I'm using it, I know, because I need a shortcut, because I'm in a hurry. But if I had all the time in the world, I would still be writing by hand, because either way, whether you're drawing or writing, the trace that appears on the page is the trace of the gesture of your hand as it issues forth out of your body, in just the same way as my voice does when I'm speaking, and that's where its expressive power lies for me, and that's why drawing is important, and it's why I don't want to think of language as an abstract system, but above all as voice, as words spoken or either by the voice or enacted with the hand in sign language or in writing, handwriting.
Yes, no, I find that that communicative question in a certain sense, as if you're the I don't know, the chalk, the blackboard is a kind of a resistance and a response. It also offers. I think it's quite intriguing. And this question of voice, this question of the musicality, perhaps even of language and of gesture. So we have one initial comment, but I just wanted to mention something else. This is more of a comment than a question for you, Tim, which is that some of the these two of the terms that you've used, renewal, and also of course love, that you just spoke about, in some of my own work, for example, on Husserl, there is a reference in his late writings where he talks about the human being as a community of love. He calls it I believe it's Liebesgemeinschaft. And it reminds me a little bit of the reference to the counterpoint to the reference that you mentioned in terms of Alfonso Lingas's community of reason. There's a kind of counterpoint there, and I think you're sort of suggesting that, and there's a certain kind of relationship between love and renewal, and it's quite fascinating that you're starting at the level of the family, or the kind of the parent-child relation, which is quite fascinating. And I have a question about that, but maybe I'll save that for a bit later.
Okay, just a couple of things before I forget. I mean, the renewal is important in counterpoint to innovation. I mean, in the mainstream discourse, all the emphasis is on innovation, which is simply replaces one set of ends with another set of ends. But renewal is about new beginnings, so it's really important. And the other thing is, when we think about the future, I'm sort of shocked by the extent to which most of our deliberations about the future are phrased in techno-scientific terms. It's just that when we think about the future, we immediately reach for science and technology, as though the problem of the future is inherently a techno-scientific problem. And I think that is a big mistake. I think we'll probably find a way of moving beyond science and technology. And fundamentally, the future is a question about kinship and descent, very classical anthropological themes. And one of the things I want to do is to try and get over this obsession with science and technology and return to rather fundamental ideas about kinship. Our kinship, not just with one another, but with everything else in the living world.
Yes. So no, thank you, Tim. So I think we have one question from Anna Deitch. Anna, would you like to unmute yourself and or comment?
Yes,
perhaps?
I don't have a question. I have a comment. But first, I would like to thank you, Tim. This was awesome. To me, it felt like hearing you. It felt a little bit like when I was pregnant and I would read like at 3 a.m. I was anxious and I would read Winnicott.
Yeah.
And this idea of embracing and of caring and caring, right? That you carry who you were and who will be, right? It was very nice to hear it. But I was like Tao, I was really like fascinated by the diagrams, and the diagram of the braid is so amazing. And I had never thought of it. Like now with my students this semester, we're working with the Senecas and the Haudenosaunee, and I know that Jolene is here. But the braid, right? That is like one thing, but it's 3 things, and braiding the corn, but it also looks like a helix, DNA helix, right? So this idea that these forms repeat themselves in all these scales and functions, it's amazing, right? And maybe not coincidentally, I don't know, but it was like I was really mesmerized by your braid.
Okay.
Thank you for the
Of course,
braid.
it's not my idea. It's very common idiom
Yeah.
among indigenous people.
The
they
snakes,
use precisely those kinds of metaphors.
Yeah, but
but anthropology just hasn't picked it up.
Very cool. Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments? No more hands raised.
Maybe I will ask a question. There may be strange noises coming from here, but I wanted to ask Tim a little bit about, I mean, I am also fascinated with, I've never heard in my entire career as an architect or an architecture student, the words love or kinship in a lecture. So maybe that's my bad, but it's kind of amazing to, and caring. And I think that the things that you're talking about in terms of kinship will be things that are continued in our conversation on Thursday. So I'm excited about that, the continuity there. But I wanted, sorry, I wanted to talk a little bit about, speaking of kinship, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about, because, my experience of your work has really been, and also Gibson's work has really been about, for me, about ecology. And, you've thought about that, the kind of the perceptual world of ecology, or the world of animals, quite extensively. And so today you talked more about kinship, but you also mentioned that the caring is not about each other only, but about our world and our environment. So I guess I wanted you to talk a little bit about that. I told you when we first talked, my interest in your diagram of living on versus in the earth, and how our kind of behavior, especially as architects, is really kind of affects, our behavior as architects, not just people, affects our future on the planet. So, and it seems to me that the kinship that you're talking about is a kinship that is towards our planet as well. So I wanted to hear just a little bit about your thinking. I know it's impossible for you to summarize your thinking on that, but.
Well, I started thinking differently about kinship as a result of thinking about lines, because in classical anthropology we draw these kinship diagrams, which are very schematic, but where every person on a kinship diagram is a point. I mean, it might be by a little triangle if it's a man, or a little circle if it's a woman, and but just a little spot-like thing. And then so those are the people, and then we draw these straight lines with a ruler that connect them up. So kinship looks like a set of connections between these isolated individuals that are kind of stuck in their different positions. And I thought, well, this can't be right, because if we want to draw a person, you wouldn't draw it as a point, you would draw it as a line, because this person is alive. And then you think, okay, if this person is a line, sort of a line that's traveling through time, then this other person is also a line. And so these lines are kind of twisting around one another. And there we have two people who are, or maybe more people in a family, who are growing older together, who are living side by side and responding to one another as they go in some sort of domestic setup. So I began to think of kinship not as a network, as a set of connections between points, but as this mesh of interlaced lines. I mean, that's where this whole idea of the braid comes from, as mesh of interlaced lines. And then, of course, if you think about it that way, it's got nothing to do with genetic connections. It has to do with care and nourishment. With the kinship is about the way in which people involve one another in their lives, support one another, nourish one another, love one another, and so on. So so the kinship itself is a process, and once you start thinking about kinship that way, then it doesn't have to be limited, obviously, to human beings or any other beings. That any other being that one is becoming involved with in one's life becomes part of this kinship mesh. So one can begin to think of the way in which the whole world is a mesh of all these lines of kinship. So, for example, it makes absolutely no difference. There's this story, you know, about how Jane Goodall, when she shook hands with a chimpanzee, said that this was the handshake that spanned 5 million years. And then you think, okay, well, you know, how many million years do you have to span every time you stroke your cat? And it's kind of ridiculous to start thinking about kinship in these purely genealogical terms, when it's really about relations of care and affect as they are lived out and performed in everyday life. So that's the way I'm thinking about it. And I think we should, when we talk about sustainability, you know, people often think about sustainability in terms of grand solutions, big technological projects and things like that. But the real sustainability is going on in what you're doing there with your kid. It's there lived out in those ordinary everyday activities in which go towards the sustaining of life. And I think what I say is that's why kinship is so important. We need to recognize that if we want a sustainable world, then it's got to be one in which kinship is absolutely central, because that is the practice of sustaining, of living beings sustaining one another in a world. It seems to me sort of so obvious, and yet it somehow needs to be said.
Yes. No, I if I can jump in here a little bit, actually we have two more questions. So perhaps we can extend it a little bit more. I think I was hearing some chatter in the background about maybe the time. But I just wanted to.
I spoke for too long.
No. I just wanted to, before I take up questions from Professors Lily Chi and John Zisovich, I just wanted to comment quickly on this reference to the braid. I also thought it was quite beautiful, and I have a personal memory of my own of my mother braiding hair. She would do it quite often. And she would put the extensions in, and she would make these things like baskets and so on. I'm not quite sure exactly how it worked, but there's a kind of speciality to it that also it's embodied. There's a certain relationship that the person performing the activity has to the other, and I love that the way it transforms the sense of the line. But so I guess one of my thoughts maybe has to do with those situations in which this generational nexus, this relationship between generations have been severed because of conditions of, historical conditions of violence and so forth. The sociologist Orlando Patterson talks about social death, natal alienation, and that transgenerational, intergenerational relation is severed because of conditions of historical violence. In his work, he's referencing the history of enslavement. So I wonder if you have a thought on those situations where there's a kind of problem that hinders or somehow or other.
Well, there is, and I think it's a great historical tragedy that generations should have been broken apart in the name of progress. And sometimes, as you say, this break was violent, as in the case where children in the colonization of indigenous societies, children were forcibly removed from their families and taken away and put in schools. that was a criminal thing but even sort of less criminally, merely the fact that that in our society it's considered normal for children to be separated from grandparents, that the children are in school and grandparents maybe in homes and such like, with all the adults. There's a sort of generation of adults in between who are sort of doing things and hard at work, and then there are on the one side the children who aren't yet ready to join in adult affairs, and on the other hand are old people who are supposed to fade away into retirement, and the old people are on one side of the adult generation and the children on the other, and they're split apart. Whereas it's historically that's the exception. Through most of history, I mean, kids would learn above all from their grandparents because they'd be in the family together and often working together. And I think that's done real. It might not be a violent separation, but it's done real harm. And I think that still today, when people are talking about the generations, they're still assuming that replacement model. And I think it's one of these things that we really have to sort out, because it's a source, I think, of many of our worries and anxieties.
Yes, yes, no, thank you. So, Tim. So perhaps I'll Lily and John. Perhaps Lily, you can go first.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I'm doing the kinship thing because I'm dealing with a daughter who's. Anyway, so I'm in the parking lot and I've been listening to your talk while driving on the highway and all that. But I wanted to thank you so much for the lecture and the moments of hopefulness and optimism that you offer in you know, thoughts like uncertainty being possibility. And so you mentioned, for instance, Hannah Arendt, and I was wondering, in thinking about Arendt, who writes about totalitarianism, she writes in the context of political theory and philosophy, writes about very dark things, but manages to find terms that, you know, give me hope, which is concepts like natality and forgiveness. You know, in each of those, human beings have a chance to start again, or to start something different. And I'm curious whether forgiveness, whether there's any relationship to some of the things that you have written about or thought about, whether that has a role outside of the realm of, let's say, politics.
You know, I haven't thought about that. It would be a really interesting. I'll need to think about it. Forgiveness as an issue. I don't think I can actually answer you straight away, because I'm going to have to go away and think about it, because to be honest, I've not thought about it, and it sounds like a really important thing to think about. I mean, just to put it very personally, in these last couple of weeks, I've been clueless. I've realized that I've read in history books about things that happened, about the Holocaust, for example, and things that happened in the Second World War, and about Hitler, and of course, you know, I've heard about it, stories from older people, but I have not lived through that. And I realized just in this last couple of weeks that I simply don't have the conceptual equipment to get my head around evil. You know, to see that evil is there, that it happens. I don't have the resources to cope with it, because I've never encountered it quite like that before. And I think a lot of people must be feeling this, because we're a generation who did not experience the Second World War directly. A lot of people must be feeling like that. And I have a feeling that this question about forgiveness is the sort of the other side of the coin from that.
Yeah. I raise it because yes, history is so important.
Yeah.
Part of your
just
conversation.
2 seconds. I'm going to have to plug my computer in, or I shall run out of power. Just give me 2 seconds.
maybe as okay.
That's all right.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I would look forward to hearing you talk about
I'll
it,
have to
given
think
that
about it.
you know, it's about the past in any case. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's a really good question. I don't want to answer it and put my foot in it because it's something I need to reflect on.
Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you. And maybe just quickly, this the question of evil and the question of forgiveness, maybe it perhaps ties in a little bit to questions of repair. And I know the anthropologist David Scott, in reference to the Holocaust, talks about certain things that are irreparable, but yet they're still a kind of part of humanity's kind of ongoing becoming, in a certain sense. So yeah, so maybe I'll John, I think John, you have a question, and maybe we'll try to after John's question, maybe just have one more comment, and then I think we would have to close, if I understood correctly.
Then I can go to bed. It's midnight here. Since
yeah, John, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, John seems to be frozen. Either that or he's very still. Okay, yeah. John, we can't hear you. You'll have to unmute yourself.
It's on again. Okay.
That's it.
It takes 3 clicks rather than 2. I just wanted to ask you, because you know there was much discussion about diagrams, and I loved some of your diagrams, but I think like some of the diagrams have a kind of limited capacity to really get at what you're talking about. And what I loved particularly was the unfolded book, because it is a diagram, but you can't, the book itself is the diagram. You know, yours is a diagram of a book, but a book itself could have done the same thing. So in a way, you know, the diagrams have a kind of limited usefulness because sometimes they're too far away from what we're familiar with. And the other diagram I loved about yours was the one with the grave. Which then somehow there's this stick figure that appears in there, you know, which is like, I don't know how to think about that stick figure in relationship to something that's diagrammatic, in relationship to humanness. You know, is it the state that we're soon to acquire? We're all going to become stick figures. Is that a kind of representation of the bones, or is this some kind of deferral to something that we don't have to think about? We all are familiar with stick figures. We all become children all of a sudden, and that's one of the things about diagrams that are beautiful, that children can kind of understand them. So I don't know if I have a question there, but I found those 2 moments kind of interesting in the world of diagrams and how we deal with them. And nowadays people do diagrams of people with masks on. You know, that's a new kind. You know, I am a diagram right now here of our current status. So I don't know what to make of that myself. So I don't expect you to make anything of it. But thank you very much. It was a wonderful.
I do. I think it's partly just it makes up for my limited capacity to draw. I mean, I wouldn't be able to. I can manage a stick figure, but to actually draw a body would be beyond my powers of doing it.
Well,
and it's, you're absolutely right. You have to accept the limitations of what a diagram can do, and it's just an aid to help people along, to clarify things sometimes, but it really, yeah, diagrams have their limits.
Well, they have their limits, but also at some point that limit is a kind of new possibility of where we go from.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you, John, and so I think we have, we probably have to let you get some sleep, Tim. It's 12:25. It's already tomorrow in England.
Yeah.
So maybe I might just. I think it's a really kind of important way to close, perhaps with John's question that goes back to the question of the diagram, the question of drawing, and in a way, the question of pedagogy and education that you ended on. And it's quite fascinating that you thematized this question of learning. There's also coming from the work of the work of Ariella Azoulay. There's a theme that's become increasingly important. Questions of unlearning. But then, Tim, you introduced another term. I can't remember at what point in the discussion in the lecture, but you also introduced a certain question of relearning that I thought is quite fascinating. And maybe it's something for us to think about in relation to these questions of generational relations, which I thought was quite fascinating in the way that you framed it as, in a certain sense, perhaps coming prior to history in a way. It's kind of there's a tangibility to it that makes history more concrete in a certain sense and lived. And then the way that you introduced to us, particularly in a contemporary context where we're faced with environmental crises and currently quite troubling political crises. You've sort of given us another way to think through. I would suggest to think through the motif of sustainability. And I think that the fact that you've used that word, I think it involves a profound intellectual generosity, I think, on your part, insofar as you've also sort of foregrounded certain problems associated with kind of purely instrumental or purely technological thinking, but also thinking of its role, not sort of putting it aside, but also thinking of its role in relation to questions of life, to questions of renewal, to questions of love, to questions of intergenerational relations, and to questions of continuity and rupture to a certain extent. So I think it's been quite extraordinary. I think I will have to look at this lecture's recording over and over and over again and take fragments from it, because it's quite layered, quite profound, but you've done it in the manner of a brilliant storyteller. And I think at least I was. I would imagine others were as well, like enraptured by your lecture, by your intellectual generosity, your care, and the care with which you brought this thought to us, and these thoughts to us, and produced an original work that clearly it seemed to be something that you yourself was thinking through or had been thinking through as you wrote. So there's a certain care of thought and a care of handing over, care of passing over, and engaging with the discipline of architecture. So I think that thank you so much for your extraordinary lecture, for your generosity, for your thoughtfulness, and for being with us into the wee hours of the morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much. Yes.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks a lot. And I'll say good night to you all. So thank you, and I hope the rest of the symposium goes really well. Okay.
Thank you, and we'll see you all on Thursday. Bye-bye.
Thank you.